I greet my mothers and my fathers and my brothers and sisters here. If children are here as well, I greet you. I thank you for showing up and for being here. My brother Jacob titled this Yoruba Philosophies and Post-Activism. And I want to share a story. This whole thing is about themes from my book, These Ones Beyond Our Fences, things from my work in the world today, which I call post-activism and what is happening around the world, and how I am, in many senses, a recovering Yoruba man. Up until recently, I didn't quite realize that I was actually Yoruba. And this is what I mean by that. I grew up in Nigeria, but to grow up in Nigeria is to be, especially if you have that privilege, is to be educated. And once you're educated away from context. You're not educated into the magic worlds of your culture. You're not educated into the intelligences of your people. You're educated away from that. You're taught to speak English like those people on BBC do. You're taught to pronounce words like people on CNN and MSNBC do. And your own language is abused. I remember being beaten by teachers who, they called it vernacular in school. And that's our language. We were told not to speak the language because the idea was to catch up with the West, to do as much as possible to catch up with those who spoke English in the West, so that we can look more like London or New York or Atlanta or Minnesota. And so I am recovering, and I'll tell you how that came to be. I am recovering a sense, even though I still grieve a sense of loss, I am recovering a sense of joy in reappreciating my culture, its wonderful histories, its wonderful orature, the folklore, the mystical traditions, earth-based traditions and understandings of interaction and non-essentialized butter. I'm recovering into these realities. And so I want to start with a few points about the senses that I feel are beautiful understandings of the world that might help us carve out or speak to us or might be resonant as we try to understand the world today. And why I was shockingly made aware, of the beauty of these things. I'll never forget the smells of eba and egusi soup. My mother with her peers making pounded yam in the kitchen, and then sweating into the pounded yam. And then I'm disgusted because I'm this American English trained kid. And I go to my father and I say, why are they sweating into our food? And my father would say, it's the sweat that makes it sweet. It's the sweat that makes the food sweet. Or my father and his friends, calling a party and then pouring a libation. And then I'm wondering, why waste a perfectly good cup of wine? And I never quite understood it. These are the sights, sounds, and memories that still linger and will never, ever leave my body. Part of my DNA, in a sense. I remember the stories of Ijakpa, the trickster tortoise. I have been reading about Eshu, who, when the British colonizers came with their traditions and their spiritualities, looked for a way to proselytize and convert people to the religion. And so they called Olodumare, the supreme god. And then they looked for a devil, and they found we didn't quite have a devil in our mythologies. We didn't have a boogeyman at all, no villain. And so they looked in our pantheon and they selected the one called Eshu. And now Eshu is now the devil. To say Eshu And if there are any Nigerians here, issue, it means devil. There's a beautiful movement, a discursive movement in Nigeria today called issue is not the devil. Issue is not the devil. And I don't think issue would mind if you met him. If you met issue and you said, "Are you the devil?" He'd be like, "Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know." It depends how you see it. He's that good a trickster. So I remember Eshu and Ijapa, my mom's cooking, the way the language of Yoruba melts through mouths like palm oil. Um, the way every Yoruba person has the greeting for every moment. For when you're sitting down, or when you're standing up, or when you're eating something, there's a greeting. It's not just good morning, good afternoon, and good night. There's a greeting for every singular moment. The way we don't have names as such, we have orikis. And for modern conveniences, we shortened our orikis to names. Orikis are actually folklore, songs that we give to our children. So that when a father once is in praise of his daughter or is just in love with his son in a moment, he sings Yoriki and tells a story about dragons or warriors or great shamans and healers just to call the son forth. But all that is shortened into names. My name actually is a story. My name is actually Adebayo, just so I could sell a book and speak to audiences around the world. I shortened it to Bayo. But my full name is Adebayo, and that actually means I came home and I met joy. I came home and I met joy. And Akomolafe is a beautiful story. It says, it means one who teaches others the good life. Afe, the good life, how to enjoy, like how to party. Well, that's another thing about Yoruba people. If we know any Yoruba people, they are always dressing. We say dress to kill. Dressing to kill. We tie our geles, we hit the streets, we block the road. It's a festive carnivalesque culture. And that those traditions traveled in slave ships across the Atlantic with Eshu along with them. And they became the creolized cultures in Brazil, in America. They became Brer Rabbit, they became hip hop. And some actually say they became the Washington Monument, who is actually, not to be indelicate, the erect penis of Eshu. So even your traditions are actually, those of us who are coming here from America, borrowed from the trickster traditions in Yoruba land. But there are other beautiful things like in senses of beauty. I just want to speak about the poetics and the aesthetics of the culture and how this is informing my work in framing a different notion of activism, which I call post-activism. So I'll just speak about three senses. Again, they're not theories, they're just artistic senses, the aesthetic, the feeling of recovery that I'm gaining from saying this counts, learning my language counts, giving my son my father's name, which my mother did, counts. My son's name is Abayomi, and there's a story there, a beautiful post-activist story there that might speak and resonate with the protesters in the US, those who are suffering with COVID-19 phenomenon, or those who want answers or new questions about climate justice and racial justice around the world today. The first sense is a sense of complementarity, a sense of complementarity. I borrowed the phrase or the word complementarity from the Danish philosopher, father of quantum physics, Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr speaks about complementarity, and that's that the world works by exclusive or exclusivity. In this guise or in this wise, in a dual slit experiment that tries to measure a particle or a wave, you can't have both at the same time. If you set up your apparatus, and I'm not going to go into the deep rabbit hole of quantum physics here. Yoruba is already enough of a rabbit hole. If you set up your apparatus to measure a particle, you've constitutionally excluded the possibility of measuring a wave. And if you set up your apparatus to measure a wave, then a particle is impossible. So this complementarity is what innovates and activates and materializes the world. That is, we are always conditioned by that which we have lost. Modernity itself is subsidized by all the things it excludes from view. There's this beautiful story, well, it's a tragic story actually, about an American woman going into a store and buying herself a bag that I read and I keep on referring to because it's a beautiful metaphor or figure of this idea, this sense of complementarity. And in her bag, in her new bag, she opened the bag, and when she got home, and she saw squeezed between the folds a letter with words in Mandarin, Chinese in it. She didn't know those words. She didn't know how to interpret it. So she called someone who might know, and the person interpreted the words. And the words, I'm paraphrasing here because I cannot remember all the words, but it said, that I'm a prisoner in some town in China. And every day we slave to make bags like this one. We're beaten, we're sent to sleep if we do not meet the quota for the day. Help, SOS, help. And that's what was hidden within the folds of a pristine bag. And I found that that's a tragic and poetic metaphor for modernity. And modernity invites us to live on the surface. You know, it says, you bought yourself a new Nokia phone or a new Apple device. Forget about where it came from. Forget about the ingredients that were broken apart to make it happen. Just notice how it smells, how clean it looks. Have you installed a new app? Have you installed a new update? Forget about the things that have subsidized it. So modernity is this march towards progress, this refusal to lean towards the side. It's the refusal to look at the past, to notice ancestrality. It does the same thing in how it creates identity. It says Shane is a white man. I don't know if you're white, Shane, but my pixels tell me you are. Chris is a black man. I don't know if you are a black man, Chris, but my pixels tell me you are. But that's what modernity does. It keeps us in identitarian boxes and says, tick this box. And then every of your tentacular extremities that are constantly molding and reshaping the world, that are sometimes glimpsed when we do a DNA ancestry test that tells us we're not as black as we are, and we're not as white as we think we are. Those threads, those interstitial longings, those lichens that are going through the soil, that are always porous, making our boundaries always porous, are cut away from view. And so modernity is the privileging of identity boxes, is the privileging of a kind of regime of visuality, a way of seeing that does not give account for all the things and conditions that made it possible. We don't know how to do that, us framed in cities. So Niels Bohr's philosophy of complementarity is that something is lost, something gives when something appears. Something is almost like a sacrificial arrangement. And this is the idea here. When I started on my decolonial journey, I started on a PhD. I trained in a neuropsychiatric hospital, taking clients and learning the ropes in psychotherapy, psychiatry. And I decided there was a crisis, and there still is that crisis in Nigeria. We don't have enough beds to cater to the population. We don't have enough people, trained clinicians. But I wondered if the crisis was about numbers, about the number of clinicians and not about something deeper. I said, how do we come to define psychopathology in the first place? Are we missing out on something? How have we imported definitions of madness or non-well-being or dissociation from the West? And how are we perpetuating these ideas of unwellness? And what have we lost in doing this? And so I decided to go underground, which was really frowned upon by the Christian university where I finished from and started to work in as a professor. So for my PhD journey, I went to Yoruba healers, underground men who taught me secrets, who threw cowries up in the air and entered into divinatory processes in the Ifa traditional religion. And I remember every time I spoke with them, I always left with a sense of sacrifice. It's not just about giving them something. It's about the idea that even your notion of psychopathology shields you from noticing that what you term a sickness might be a breakthrough, a spiritual breakthrough. They invited me to see that. Oh, I asked one question one time. I said, because I was really in my PhD spirit, and I was like, so what's your nosology? What's your diagnostic tool for determining, according to the DSM, what's the diagnostic tool for determining auditory hallucination or visual hallucination? How do you name these things? How do you determine a person needs help? And one of them, whose name I will not mention here, said to me, why would you want to take pills or medicine if you start hearing voices? What if that's the voice of your father trying to teach you something? What if that's the voice of your mother? This was the world that I had pushed behind in my quest for progress, in my quest for ascension or transcendence, or the catch-up imperative of the global South. And so they taught me a sense of complementarity, that something is lost, that the world works by sacrifice, that if you want to ask something, even knowing is a form of sacrifice. Something gives. You don't just know in some kind of linear way. To see is to risk blindness. To not know or to know is to risk the pleasure of not knowing. Something always gives. And this is the culture that I left behind, that I'm slowly, painfully, but slowly returning to and learning from. The second sense that I want to share is a sense of the modern human, the exquisite modern human. Yoruba is a very post-humanist tradition. We not only live in or inhabit a world that is more than human. There are other things around us that exceed the human. Animal spirits. I shared a joke recently about going to the marketplace, and one of the myths in my part of the world is that if you bend down and look between your legs behind you, you will see things you're not supposed to see. That if you're in a marketplace, not just anywhere, so if you do it now, it may not work. But it's the idea that if you go to a crossroads, like a marketplace, and you bend down and look between your legs behind you, you will see very strange creatures. You will see people walking in their heads. You see spirit forms. You see monstrous figures. You might glimpse the masquerade, who is another very powerful figure in Yoruba mythology. So don't do it, is what they say. I remember trying to do it one day, and my uncle beat me up, basically slapped me upside the head and said, don't you dare do it. So this idea that the world is imbued with conspiracies. Yes, like that voice that just came in, that something is always popping in unexpectedly that something is always lurking behind the corner. That if you go deep into the forest, deep enough, you know, if you leave the highway long enough, you will happen upon a spirit or two. And by spirit, I don't mean a ghostly Hollywoodized figure. I mean, you would witness beings, embodied beings, that put paid or dismantle or unsettle or disturb the centrality of the human body. And so even the concept of aye comes from a realization that agency is not primarily human. Freedom is not primarily human. Choice is not primarily human. We participate in a world that exceeds us. When we move our hands, we're moving with ancestors, we're moving with microbial worlds, we're moving with bacterial forms. To do anything is to do with, which is why where I got the idea of witnessing, that we don't just witness the world, we witness the world. To see is to see with. Seeing is a political enterprise. Every gesture is haunted by that which is invisible, which is why I think of the COVID-19 phenomenon as an insurgency of the invisible, an eruption of those things that resist articulation and intelligibility. That's the modern human. And finally, a sense, no, I think I have one more that I wrote down. A sense of dispersal. What do I mean by that? Yoruba people are a very tricky nation. Even the word Yoruba is said to have come from Muslims, the Hausa people up north, so that we don't actually have a stable name. There are hundreds of dialects in this category that they call Yoruba. But across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, we are known as Lukumi, Aku, and other names, so that there isn't a coherent, we're like sand, you see. There isn't a coherent Yorubaness. There isn't an essence to it. So Yoruba people tend to speak about two kinds of Yoruba people, and not kinds in terms of categories, it's just by a way of conversation here. The Itonkanle, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that well, and the Awonile and the Itokale. The Awonile are those that are closer to the hometown, what they call the Yoruba land. But the Itakonle are the dispersed, those who have spread out abroad, those who have become creolized in other traditions, those who have led or created a Santeria religion or Gayap culture in Trinidad and Tobago, those who have done other things in the Caribbean or in the so-called New World. And hidden in this idea that we are spread out and we're at home is the idea that place is never still, that home is never final. There is no sense of arrival, which is why if you go to a Yoruba person in Nigeria and you were apologetic for wearing Yoruba dresses, like, I'm so sorry, I come from the West and we're taught not to culturally appropriate clothes and languages from people of your culture, I'm so sorry. That person would probably look at you and laugh, like, wear it, go ahead, you're spreading out, you're doing us good, spread it, speak our language. And that is not to dismantle or disparage the real concerns that come with appropriation. And of course, the struggles and resistances that come with people who want to keep their cultures from being bastardized or being instrumentalized by modern arrangements. And yet there is a sense, this is a different ethical approach, a sense of freedom, a sense of the trickster that innovates Yoruba culture, that go ahead, speak the language. I have a German brother who speaks more Yoruba than I do. And we held a workshop. We held a workshop together in North Carolina, I think 2 years ago. And people were baffled that he was speaking more Yoruba than I. And I said, this is Yoruba. Yoruba is not just awonile. Yoruba is interconle. It's the spread out. Those that are yet to come. Our ancestors are yet to come. A white woman, and this is, I paid attention to this in my book. A white woman came, I think from Holland, from somewhere in Europe, and became almost a goddess in Yoruba land. She was so powerful and priestly and majestic that she took children, she took Yoruba children to herself, and she was able to save a Yoruba shrine from government encroachment. She's so revered by Yoruba people today. They call, I think they call her the White Witch or something like that. But the idea that a stranger can come and take on those traditions doesn't fit too neatly in the ethical traditions of the West. And yet the Yoruba people embrace it because they know they're not quite still themselves. They're incoherent. And yet this incoherence is a form of gift, is a form of abundance, is a form of freedom. And finally, the sense that I want to speak to is the sense of the crossroads or the orita. And this is where I say this all the time. The times are urgent. Let us slow down. And many people hear that and say, what Bayo is saying is we should reduce the speed of what we're doing, do a little yoga, pull out a mat, go on a holiday. That's not what I mean. That's not the sense here. The sense of slowing down is not a sense of, it's not a function of reducing one's speed. It's a function of waiting at the crossroads and allowing oneself to be met by beings greater than ourselves. The crossroads is the trafficking of bodies, spiritual, material, spiritual. You know, modernity is the construction of highways. And so the Yoruba people have a spiritual understanding that justice doesn't lie at the end of the highway, which is why it seems to be so elusive, just retreating further and further into the distance. What happens when the highway becomes famished itself? When I'm going on this highway, I'm trying to get to the city on the hill, the promised city, heaven in the distance. But no matter how I down that throttle, I'm getting no closer. When will justice come? Yoruba people and their understanding of orita is that, or the crossroads, or the, poetically speaking, the place where the three ways meet, orita. Their understanding teaches people that what to do on the highway, and when you find yourself on a highway and the highway is proliferating speed and never arrival, the thing to do is to notice the crossroads and to shape-shift into a different form that cannot be encoded or put into an algorithm by the highway. In a sense, we are creatures of the highway as people in modernity. Our activisms are shaped by this notion of the highway. We want to speed up. We want to get to justice in the distance. We want to do as much as possible to get to the promised land. This moral arc of justice that dips, in our favor, that Martin Luther King spoke about. We want to reach the end of the story. But we've been doing this for a long time. We've been at it for a long time. We've been doing climate justice work, racial justice work, ecological justice work. And we seem to be caught in a tyranny of cycles. What to do, Yoruba people would say, is to learn how to fall to the side, is to learn how to slow down. And slowing down is not reducing the speed, because that's what the highway wants you to do, a binary, speed up or slow down. Slowing down is about stepping off the highway and finding fugitive dispersals where we can shapeshift into more than human forms, where we can touch our long bodies, where we can account for ancestrality, where we can learn how to speak different languages, ontological languages, where we can learn how to grieve, where grieving itself is a form of activism, and where all these things together might make exquisite new visions possible, new imaginations that are not possible when we stick to the highway. So when Yoruba people say, slow down, I framed it that way. It's reading Yoruba traditions. But I want to honor the wisdom that gave birth to that frame. When they say slow down in times of urgency, when they say in order to find your way, you must become lost, they're inviting a sense of lostness that we don't know how to access today. They're inviting a monstrous opening of the body, a wound dehiscence, a pollination by other beings. They're inviting a libation. These senses and more that I don't think I can do justice within 2 hours or even 2 years, because there's so much to unpackage there, gave birth to my understanding of post-activism. I've been speaking about post-activism for 2 years or 3 years or more now. And the idea of post-activism is not a superior form of activism, a dismissal of conventional activism. Post-activism points our attention or brings our attention to the irony of responsivity. Let me break that down. That is, when we think we're acting, we're actually acting with. Activism, the model of activism we have today is we have good information, good action, good results. If we have the intention, the political will, the political resources, if we put this in an algorithm, we can find the results we're looking for. It's a model of design, but it's a very humanistic model. It's a model that centralizes human agency. What we're learning today, not just in Yoruba cultures, but in quantum physics, in feminist explorations of agency and technosciences, we're learning that we never act alone. That to sit down is to sit down with things around us. That agency is never unspoiled, never pure. That when we act upon the world, even with the truest and the most beautiful of intentions, we're acting within a space, within an assemblage of other kinds of bodies. I remember a friend of mine told me once that he's a permaculture artist, and he told me, I want to get people off Facebook. And I was like, yeah. It's a very American yeah, because he's American. I was like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to get people off Facebook. And I was like, tell me how you're going to do it. We're in California together. And he said, I'm going to open a Facebook page where we can get people off Facebook. And the irony of that was lost on him. The idea that he was acting within the same world, the same paradigm that he seeks to refute, that he seeks to exceed, using the master's tools in a way. And even if it wasn't Facebook, if it was some other kind of company, the lesson to learn here is that we will often reinforce the very conditions we're trying to escape in our bid to escape it. We will often reinforce those traditions, those ideas, those ideologies. We're tethered and anchored in ways that our rationalistic systems do not know how to comprehend. We're dealing with something more than just an organizational protocol or a bureaucratic form of social justice reform. We're dealing with much more than racial justice training here. Something deeper wants to be met, something that exceeds that box that we're so used to, the algorithms, the equations we're used to. Post-activism helps us notice the material irony of responsivity. Responsivity is a fancy word for capability. what we're capable of doing, what we're responsible to. It helps us, it brings us to a place, and this is a fugitive definition. I tend to refuse to define post-activism because it's a fugitive thing. It escapes definitions. It escapes the plantations of sterilization or categorization. But I could say about post-activism that it brings us to a place of noticing the inherent instabilities of agency and power. And here's a story about how the slaves on the ship, on the slave ships, those 11 million people transported across hundreds of years, how they undercut the powers that were dominant. They tried many times to resist in terms of defeating them, but that didn't quite work. And the others had firepower that they didn't have. I learned a story, and I started to decolonize, and I don't want to say decolonize myself as if it's a simple thing to do. But as I started to relearn and recover into the sweltering heat of Yoruba culture, I asked myself a question that was disturbing for me at the time, that if these gods, Yoruba gods, Eshu, Yemoja, Ogun, Shango, Olodumare, Oshun, if all of them are powerful, as the traditions say they are, why is it that they didn't do anything when the ships came? Why didn't they fight back? Is it that firepower, guns, black powder? Was it that all of that was, was it that they were more powerful than our gods and goddesses and spiritual traditions? And then I learned from one of my literary elders, I've never met him, that it's not that they're more powerful. It's that our notion of power living in modernity is impoverished. We constitute power as a determination of other kinds of bodies. I have power over you when I can control you. But in a relational world, in a processual world, in a performative world where things don't exist, only relationships exist. In that kind of world, control is never entire. There are cracks, even in the punch, even in the boot that stamps on my neck. There are cracks, there are openings that the person who wears that boot can never account for or does not know how to articulate. I learned a different notion of power that led me to write a poem about the breaking open of the back with the slave whip. By whipping open my back, you might think you're undoing me, but you're also undoing yourself. And we're both undone in this moment. Power found a way to undercut colonial power, imperial might. How did it do that? It found other places of power. It exposed the inherent instability of colonial might. And what happened in the New World? They created the rich Caribbean cultures of reggae music. They created Gayat communities. They created Rastafarian art. They created all the traditions today that now live in those beautiful places. And then another thing that I learned is that Eshu, the trickster, actually traveled with the slaves. And not just traveling with the slaves, he brought the ships in the first place, which was shocking to me. He brought the ships in the first place. Yes, there's a story told that Ogun, the god of war, saw that the ships were coming and he mounted up an insurgency. Let's go take them down. And Eshu, the trickster, met him on the way and gave him wine or palm wine and put him to sleep. Why? He wanted to travel and see the world. It doesn't seem like a good justification for slavery, but it was never meant to be a justification, because in a trickster's world, justifications are absolutely missing. Justifications don't exist. Only emergencies, or emergence, I would say. Only lonely becomings are heard or felt. So post-activism is the coming to touch the material agency of the assemblage, not just a human agent that is supposedly the fulcrum of social change. It's also coming to other places of power. When power is not working for you, when power is not working for us, then we cannot use power to claim power. I think it's a powerful example of what is happening in the United States today. I think justice will not do. Whatever resolution or closure we seek for those, who have been hurt and killed and murdered on the streets, justice will never do, because justice is also part of the apparatus, the system that seeks closure. It's part of the furniture that wants to enclose itself and its meaning-making practices. Post-activism is the way, an opening to a constellation of practices that might help us compost ourselves, compost our boundaries as human beings, learn to ask new questions, if that might be possible. So it's a practice of failure, I would say, because fugitivity is failure, but not the failure that modernity has taught us, the failure that makes everything possible, the trick that makes everything possible. That's the kind of failure I'm talking about. So let me end somewhere around here. I'm not sure what to end with. I came fully in the spirit of tricksters. In these past few days here in India, I've been doing a lot of work with my family. I've been traveling for a long time, and suddenly I find my feet are no longer poised in midair. I'm learning to be at home again. I'm learning the wisdom of my daughter, Alethea. But I'll tell you a story that I've told many times. Some of you may not have heard it. And it's a story about how my daughter taught me the evocative cacophony of the world that I do not even know how to see or glimpse yet. We were in Richmond, Virginia, which I heard this morning. Protesters had burned down a police station or something like that. And we're living there, just hanging out with my sister-in-law. And one day, my daughter said to me, she was 2. She said, let's go for a swim. I don't know how to swim. But earlier that morning, I had sworn, I see my big mother, Auntie Signy here. She's heard this story many times. Early that morning, I wanted to do a yes man experiment. The experiment was to say yes to everything my daughter would ask me to do. An experiment I haven't conducted ever since because it was too dangerous for me and for her. But she said, Dada, let's go swim. She calls me Dada. Dada, let's go swim. And I said, yes, of course, yes. I'm sticking to my routine. Let's do it. So I felt, yeah, I would wade in the water. I would hold her, put the thing around her and she wouldn't drown or anything. We'll be fine. And there's a person there to pull us out if we drown anyway. And so we started to march to the swimming pool, which is just a few feet away. When instead of heading to the swimming pool, she turned to a river nearby, a lake nearby. And for some reason, she felt that was the swimming pool, which is confusing because we had been swimming together as a family. But yet she felt the lake was a swimming pool. And I tried to say, no, but this is a swimming pool. And I remembered my practice for that morning. So I said, okay, the lake is the swimming pool. And so we started to walk towards the lake. Midway to the lake, she said, Dada, stop, remove your slippers, put on my own slippers, and I'll wear your slippers. Why, Ali? Just for fun. And so I did that, and it was getting really awkward because my feet are size 45 and hers were, I don't know. I could barely get my toes in. And we started to march towards the lake. People were jogging nearby and looking at us awkwardly. I was getting afraid that I might be arrested or something worse. And then we got to the side of the lake, and she just stopped and stood still. That was it. That was it. She stood still and did nothing. Absolutely. I can still remember her face, just her very toddling face, just looking into at the lake and saying absolutely not, like she was beholding uh, the regress and progress of angels from heaven and on earth. And I wanted to understand her sense of wonder, but more importantly, I wanted to establish a father-daughter moment. So I wanted to share, create a Kodak moment, is what I called it. I wanted to tell her about the things I was learning about Yoruba people, her own grandfather, with whom she never met. And I started to speak, and I said, Alethea, I've always wanted to tell you. And she just said, shh, Dada, shh. No talking, Dada, no talking, um, which was shocking. And so I kept quiet, and we just stood there. And minutes rolled into longer minutes, and longer minutes rolled into really, really awkward minutes where just two figures standing. And on the book, they captured both of us standing, holding each other's hand and just doing absolutely nothing on the front cover of the book. But I don't know how to tell you this, folks, because immediately or at some moment in time, I had a spiritual experience. The lake didn't divide into two. I didn't get a halo. I didn't levitate. I didn't hear a voice. But I left, I had a very profound sense of the interconnectedness of things. And not in the woo-woo sense that is probably popularized today. Like, if you've ever stood still, with an intention to gain some kind of inward access to the things that we rudely call selves, but in beholding the things around us, the things that we sometimes don't grant the light of day in our discussions about what matters, the material world, the material, spiritual, discursive world. I just stood still like Solomon of old would have stood still. And I noticed ants. I smelt the wind, if you will. A blade of grass meant so much more than every theology that I had learned up to that moment in time. My PhD could not stand in the light of the voices, the quacking of ducks nearby. It just felt really powerful to me, and I still struggle to explain it with words. And to cut the long story short, having this experience still lingers till today. But Alethea punctuated the experience and said, Dada, put this dirt on your face. All of a sudden. So I felt, okay, I can do that. And I put the sand on my face. And she said, eat some of it. And that's where I terminated the experiment. I said, that's it, we're going home. And we went home. But home has never been the same. I'm still in the home that Alethea is creating. She's an unschooled child. We're treating Alethea as an elder instead of as a tabula rasa that needs to be filled with civilization's teachings. We're learning to follow her. We're learning to treat her philosophy as serious work, as the kind of work that maybe a COVID-19 phenomenon is inviting us to do, instead of rushing our children to Zoom and teaching them, everything that is online. We're learning to stay with her, with the awkwardness of her. We're learning to see that forward movement may not be possible anymore, but awkward movement is always there. The orita, the crossroads, the invitation to shapeshift, to become less than, more than, inhuman, other than human, to listen to voices, to learn how to play with seeds, to learn how to play with plants, to learn how to conduct speculative histories, to know that there are fugitive histories that are possible, to tell stories in other ways that are not possible, to learn that the world is made of play. And to take things seriously is to take play seriously. All of this is what my Yoruba, Indian, English, because her mother is also part English, Iranian, her mother is also part Iranian, child is teaching me. My full name is Alethea Anya Akomolafe. My son's name is Kea Abayomi Akomolafe. And my name for the last time is Adebayo Akomolafe. And that's where I'll end it. Thank you so much for listening.